Okay, welcome to our Erev Shabbat Friday Perashat class. Perashat Mesorah, or as we know it to be in our tradition and call it in our community, Perashat Tahor, as we say in cover-up language, we call it Sagi Nahor, and that is that. So we don't want to label the Parashat with the term of impurity. And so we call it ironically instead Tahor, purity. It's also Erev Shabbat Hagadol. But 1.5 parashiot in the Torah HaKadoshah, we've spent on a phenomenon with many laws of which have no relevance at all to our lives. In fact, unlike laws of Korbanot, that don't have relevance to our lives currently, but at least we anticipate their relevance and we see their significance, as opposed to 1.5 parashiot, which is last week Tazriah, and half of this week's Parashat Mesorah, on a phenomenon and a group of laws that we can't relate to, we don't understand their rationale, and we can't even say that we necessarily anticipate them emerging back in our lives and their significance whatsoever. And of course, I'm talking about the phenomenon of sara'at and the laws regarding the mesorah, the person that contracts this condition called sara'at, we label him the mesorah, and or other assets and possessions that we have that contract this condition. It is startling, really, that the Torah has spent so much text, so much ink, so many pisukim, so much discussion on these laws. And there certainly is, there are Mishnayot and much discussion in Torah Sheba'al Peh spent on them. So the laws themselves play out. They have detail. They have substance, but the idea, the concept, and the fact that the Torah invests so much energy in it is beyond us, or seemingly so anyway. So let's, instead of discussing Shabbat HaGadol, because we have a nice 1 week lead from now until Pesach, let's instead try to break down and somehow break ground regarding this concept and this idea. And really, it'll be tidbits of information and hopefully will shed some light. Let's give some facts and figures regarding the Mesorah. First of all, sara'at, which many like in English, in the English language, translate into or identify as leprosy. We don't know that necessarily is the case at all. Perhaps some of the characteristics mimic the disease of leprosy, perhaps, but we can only identify it by its Hebrew terminologies. The parasha itself, the parashiyot, well, this week's parasha mainly speaks about the korbanot that an individual brings when he contracts sara'at, and also the concept of sara'at in the house. Altogether, in both parashiyot, cumulatively, there are 7 different types of sara'at identified by the Torah. 5 of them is on the body, the individual person, either a person's skin or on their hair, could be on different locations on their body, could be on their head, could be on their facial hair, could be anywhere else on the body. There's 5 of them that are directly physically impactful to our bodies, 1 having to do with our clothing, our outer covering, and 1 having to do with our external surrounding, which is our homes. 7, keep that number in mind. It's a significant number. Now, in terms of the why, the Torah itself gives us, you can say, very little insight, but certainly no direct attribution of other activities which will then lead to the consequence of sara'at. We're not told that it's a punishment for anything particular, but we do know, en yisurin belohet, Hachamim teach us, there is no such thing in this world as experiencing any form of hardship without being able to relate it, and we don't not always able to do this, but it is true that it's relatable to some negative activity, some sinful activity that we were engaged in at whatever level. Connecting the dots is a difficult thing to do and not always advisable to break our heads to do, but we know it's a truism. Despite that, we're not really told, we're not given any framework as to how to connect these dots, and not told why one contracts this disease or this condition, and that's what makes it so much more mysterious. However, the Torah gives us some circumstantial hints, and that is because of the fact that at the end of last week's parasha, in terms of the consequence, besides the protocol of bringing korbanot, etc., it says that the mesorah, the person who contracts this, if he contracts one of the 5 blemishes on his body, that mehus lamachaneh moshavo, for 7 days, he must dwell outside of the encampment. And we know that al safam yahteh, that he has to cover his face and his mouth, and that people that see him tameh yakra pronounce that this person is impure and he's tameh. So because of the separateness of it, and because of the mouth, the face and mouth covering, and based on tradition, we popularly and most commonly hear and understand the avirah attributed to the consequence of mesorah, the sarat, is lashon hara. And in fact, Hachamim tell us that there's somewhat of an acronym in the word mesorah, and that is mosi shem ra. Of course, mosi shem ra is a different avirah than lashon hara. It's more severe. While lashon hara is true information, true derogatory information, mosi shem ra is false derogatory information. But both obviously in the same family of avirot. That is very much focused on, for correct reasons, obviously, by Hachamim and by different drashot and classes that we hear, and therefore you get a lot of Lashon Hara classes during these weeks. This won't necessarily be a Lashon Hara class, but I will refer you to the way the Hachamim and the Gemara connect the consequence and punishment to the person to the possible cause of this condition in terms of the wrongdoing and the iniquity that he committed. And that is Lashon Hara. So I quote from the Gemara, Masechet Arachim, page 16b. One of the questions, when the Hachamim asked the other, Man nishtana mesorah shamra Torah yibadad yeshev mechus lamachaneh moshabo. Why is this person called the mesorah, why is he so different in terms of his punishment that the Torah says, like in no other sin, badad yeshev, he has to sit quietly and alone, mechus lamachaneh, he has to sit outside of the encampment. He has to dwell external to everybody else. Why? Says the Gemara. And the answer is given by the Gemara. Who hivdil ben ish leishto ben ish lere'ehu, ficha chamra Torah badad yeshev. He, because of his irresponsible communication and the way he chose his words, he caused division between people, sometimes between wife and husband, or otherwise, generally speaking, just between man and his fellow man. So because of his sinful behavior in causing division and friction and sometimes quarrel between people, so midah keneged midah, measure for a measure, his consequence will separate him as well. And that is a justified punishment to his wrongdoing. The other Gemara, in the same Amud, another statement, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi asks, why is the Mesorah different in that the prescription of korbanot in the aftermath of the person's healing and recovering from sarat is sheteh siporim the tahorato. He has to bring 2 live birds, one is slaughtered, one is not, dipped alive in the blood of the other one, sprinkled on the Mesorah. What is the difference between them, between that and all other korbanot? So the Gemara answers, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu aseh or asa ma'aseh patit, lefichach amra Torah yavi korban patit. he did an act, and Rashi explains what that means, is that he used language, he sounded out, so to speak. He took things that were supposed to be more clandestine on the hush-hush, and he brought them to light. He spoke. He was irresponsible with his verbiage, and therefore he brings a korban of tweeting birds that make a lot of noise. All right, the Gemara is connecting the dots for us. But less known, far less known, is a statement made in the Gemara on the previous Amud, page 16a of Masechet Arachim. And that is a statement by Rabbi Yochanan. And that is, Al Shiv'a Devarim Nega'im Ba'im, that indeed the blemish, the disease, the condition of Sara'at is contracted by a person because of 7 different types of wrongdoings. 7, not 1. The top of the list, Lashon Hara. Let's name the other 6. Lashon Hara 1, 2, Shifichut Damim, murder. 3, Shivuat Shaf, swearing falsely. 4, Gilui Arayot, illicit relations. 5, Gasgasut Ruach, arrogance. 6, Gezel, thievery. And 7, Sarut Ayin, miserliness, not being generous, rather being cheap and holding back on other people. 7 different averot. Here's my problem. Should be your problem as well. First, difficult to see a connection between these different 7 types of averot. Also, we see that they are seemingly on many different levels. You have murder on one hand, murder for goodness sakes, and illicit relations. And on the other hand, all right, swearing falsely, pretty serious, and then going down to just a character trait called arrogance, all the way down to just being miserly. How are we actually attributing one single punishment, let's call it a punishment, to those diverse type of extreme wrongdoings in terms of the contrast, such a stark contrast in the diversity, such a polar stretch between the severity of those type of wrongdoings? And also, why is it then that if there are 7, that by far, Lashon Hara is the one that's most focused upon and most popular, but also the one that, according to the Gemara, is the one that bears the consequence of sitting in isolated manner and covering his mouth because of Lashon Hara? Why aren't consequences given that are specific and relatable to the other 6 type of avirot that cause Lashon Hara? I'm sorry, that cause Sara'at. So I'm going to ask you to follow me as I try to build up to the answer with some other fun facts. Not so fun, but facts about Sara'at. We know if you track through Tanakh that it's possible to find a total of 7 people in Torah and Nevi'im who contracted Sara'at. 7. It's a nice quiz. If we had time to pause, I would do so and allow you to try to jot down a few on paper and test your knowledge of Tanakh. But there are 7. And it happens to be that the Gemara relates some of them even to those 7 different types of wrongdoings and iniquities and connects those dots. Let's see who they are. The first one is Moshe Rabbeinu in the conversation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu by the burning bush. At one point when he's asking for signs from God, Hashem, told him to stick your hand in your pocket, take it out, and it says, "V'hineh yado misorat kashaleh." His hand has contracted sara'at like snow, slow looking. The second one we know is his sister Miriam. Later on, Perashat Bahalotecha, when she spoke about Moshe, seemingly Lashon Hara, that it says, "Hineh Miriam misorat kashaleh." Again, she was same term. She had contracted sara'at like snow-like looking. Number 2. Number 3, Yoav ben Surya, the chief of staff in general of David HaMelech. We know that it says in Shemuel Bet, as part of the consequence that he was going to suffer from murdering the other Sar Sava, the other head general, Abner Bener of Shaul, that David HaMelech said that he would always have a Zab and Mesorah in his families, and he would also contract Sarat. A non-Jew in the book of Melachim, Naaman, who was the head general of the king of Aram, the great empire of Aram. He was the Sar Sabab, the king of Aram. He was called a Gibor Said Mesorah. He was a mighty man and a warrior, and he also had seemingly a permanent condition of Sarat. He was sent to Elisha, the prophet, to cure his Sarat. Elisha eventually did cure his condition of Sarat. And so that was Naaman. Number 5, Gehazi, the person who cursed David HaMelech when he was fleeing as a refugee from his son Avshalom, that tragic story. So it says that as a curse from David HaMelech that Sarat, yes, he told Gehazi that the Sarat of Naaman was going to cling to him and his offspring forever, and he left. Again, that's that terminology. He left him, and he had Sarat like snow. So we have 5. We have 5. Azaryahu, the king, who was at first told to be a righteous king. Something went wrong at some point, and we're told both in the book of Melachim and the book of Divrei Hayamim that he contracted Sarat. The wrongdoing we know he did is he wasn't the Kohen, and yet he offered the Ketoret, the incense, in the Bet HaMikdash. The 7th one is something that's less explicit, so I saved it for the end, and that is Paro, the one who kidnapped Sarah Imenu. And it says that Vainaga Hashem, he smite the Paro and the people of his household with Nega'im Gedolim. And Nega'im, that term for blemish, is used to imply Sarat in certain places in the Torah. So those are the 7. We can, of course, relate some of them to the different Averot given for Lashon Hara. Obviously, Miriam, we relate that to Lashon Hara. Some say that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke about the Jewish people, Lashon Hara. Yoav ben Surya was guilty of murder. That's one. Gehazi was guilty of the swear and the curse in the name of God against David HaMelech. Azaryahu the king was guilty of gasut haruach, of arrogance, the way he thought he can have authority and enter in any type of position, including using the activities reserved only for Kohanim. So we do have some of those, perhaps all of them, of the characters that contracted, the 7 characters who contracted Sarah. Of course, Paro, Gilui Arayot, right? He took Sarah, and who knows how many other women, and tried to be with her, and that's illicit relations. So lining up the 7 characters who contracted Sara'at with the 7 possible Averot, sins for which one contracts it, is something that the Gemara does partly, and we can continue and somehow find that connection with all 7 of them. But there's another connection that I believe that we can find, and I don't have a commentator yet to back me up. I'm going to give it my best shot. And that is as follows. We know that Aseret HaDeberot and the 2 Luchot, 5 and 5 of the 10, so to speak, 10 commandments on each of the Luchot, of the tablets, we know amongst them, they don't end up being even in terms of Aseh and Lo Taseh, positive, negative commandments. There are 3 positive commandments and 7 negative don't do's in the Aseret HaDeberot. Fascinatingly, I believe that these 7 Averot, for which the Gemara says that one contracts Sarat, can be lined up with the 7 Lo Ta'aseh, don't do negative commandments in the Aseret HaDeberot. And let's take on one side the tablet, you have Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah, we're told by Hachamim and the Gemara, is a result of Ga'ava Gasut Haruach, of arrogance. Now you have, of course, the other one is Lo Tisah Hashem Adonai Ohecha Lashav. You have Shivu'at Shav. So arrogance and swearing falsely are right there. Of course, on the left side, the other tablet, all 5 of them are negative commandments. You indeed have murder. You indeed have thievery, although it's kidnapping. You indeed have gilui arayot. You have illicit relations. You have lo taneh al re'acha shaker. You have another form of falsehood, which is another form of shivuat shav. And you have lo tahmod, not coveting, which of course, among other emotions and desires, is a result of miserliness, which one would, is not satisfied with his own possessions and covets, and therefore would just like to be able to get and take possessions of others without working for them on his own. So in an amazing way, we just aligned 6, mind you, out of the 7 sins for which one contracts sarat, to the 7 averot in the 10 commandments, in the Aseret Deberot. And you ask yourself to begin with about the 10 commandments, why those 7 are the 7 don't do's? Because some of them are the most severe in the Torah, but again, like our conversation, they're not the 7 most severe don't do's. Amongst them, you have maybe 3 of the top ones. And a possible reason is because they all demonstrate and imply the most destructive behavior possible. The type of behavior that destroys a society, destroys family, destroys a society, of course, the Jewish society, but destroys a world as well. And you just think of it. Think about murder and relations, thievery, but also think about the traits of arrogance, traits of not having compassion for others. Think about the corruptive behavior in swearing falsely and being involved in falsehood and disingenuous behavior. And of course, in a court setting or just as individuals, and how much corruption, how many countries and governments have been laden, including the modern world, with corruption that makes it rot from within. How much of the Aseret HaDeberot is there because it is, you could say, the framework for the most destructive type of behavior that a society can demonstrate. And without observance of those 7 negatives in the Aseret HaDeberot, the world crumbles, not just Jewish society, the world crumbles. And that's why the world embraces, by the way, Aseret HaDeberot, because everyone needs the 10 commandments to survive. And so there you have another 7. The 7 types of blemish. There are 7 avirot for which you contract the blemish. You have 7 people in Tanakh who have contracted that blemish. You have 7 avirot of no don't do's, negative commandments in the Aseret HaDeberot that can be aligned to those 6 of those 7 sins. But then there's Lashon Hara. Then there's Lashon Hara, which you want to know. Why is it the focus? Why is it seemingly the reason for the real consequence of the isolation and the mouth covering in our Perashat? And what everybody seems to focus on and what the Gemara focuses on as well. And the reason, I believe, is that destructive behavior in society is usually or almost always triggered by speech. Whether it's the most extreme behavior like murder, or whether it's just character traits like arrogance or miserliness, almost always triggered by the gift of mankind of speech. And that is why the most severe statements are made regarding Lashon Hara and other sins of the tongue. As for some examples, Yerushalmi tells us for 4 iniquities, man is punished in this world, and the punishment remains in the next world. Avodah zarah, illicit relations, murder, and above them all, says the Yerushalmi, Lashon Hara. The Gemara in Masechet Sotah says 4 types of people, groups of people, don't receive the presence of God in the next world. One of them is those who speak Lashon Hara. Masechet Pesachim, anyone who speaks Lashon Hara, it's worthy to throw him to the dogs and let him be devoured. Rabbi Yishak Arama in the Akedat Yishak explains that a person, a human being, was invested, infused with godliness. God breathed into the first man a breath of life, a spirit of life. And since speech determines the essence of man, the way man distinguishes himself from other speeches, speech must have a certain quality to it. God has empowered us, Am Yisrael, all of mankind, and privileged us with the ability of speech to express our intellect, our higher intellect that man has, and especially distinguish Am Yisrael with the opportunity of speech of Torah, Kedosha, and Mizvot. One who uses his speech to harm others, to cause destructiveness in this world, has abused his nishmat hayim, has abused the breath, the infused spirit that HaKadosh Baruch Hu invested in man. And because of that, that is considered to be the father and mother of all types of destructive behavior, and indeed triggers the most severe type of behavior that man can be guilty of and the world can experience. And those perhaps are the 6 modes of behavior and activities, the other 6 that are the sins for which one contracts sarat. Triggered, begun, and motivated by sin A, the pinnacle, the top, the central iniquity and avirah. And that is Lashon Hara, which causes the others, and together, all 7 of them, the destructive behavior listed in the Awasera de Berot, can end up causing sarat and end up causing us and forcing us to isolate this person until he learns his lesson. And so, a parasha and a half of our Torah Kedusha is spent on speaking about a disease and a type of condition that one can contract, with examples throughout Tanakh, and with different types of averot that perhaps are the underpinning and the causation of those averot, but really, beyond everything else, the true foundation, the true undercurrent, the true cause of those destructive behaviors and their consequences and punishments for them is the sin of the mouth, the sin of Lashon Hara. And therefore, in its quiet way, without actually saying Lashon Hara, because it's normally whispered, it's normally inconspicuous, and it's normally done in private, that the Torah privately spent a parasha and a half warning us of destructiveness and of the consequences and of the disastrous results of one who abuses his speech, and therefore motivates us, begs us, and encourages us to take the gift of the nishmat hayim, of the ruach malala, of the speech that we have as the distinguished species of mankind and Jewish nation, to take it seriously and to treat it in a holy, distinguished, and pure manner. Amen v'amen. Shabbat shalom.